All right, welcome again, and I am delighted to introduce Don Macke. Don Macke leads E2 Entrepreneurial Ecosystems, formerly the Center for Rural Entrepreneurship, which is an initiative with Network Kansas to build sustainable entrepreneurial ecosystems across North America. Don has over 40 years of community, economic development, and policy experience. He was most recently the co-founder and co-director of the National Center for Rural Entrepreneurship. Through his work, Don helps communities and regions throughout North America grow entrepreneur-focused economic development strategies and ecosystems. Don calls Nebraska home and is a proud resident of America's Great Plains region. Don will be presenting for about 25 minutes, and then we will have another 25 minutes for meaningful and lively discussion, willing it into existence, prior to our closing remarks. All right, so I am going to let you take it away, Don.
All right, very good. Well, I've got my Radical Rural t-shirt on, folks. So good afternoon, and hopefully you can see my screen from Tupelo, Mississippi to Ord, Nebraska. Is that showing up okay?
Yes, it is. We can see it.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. We actually tried really hard to tell this story at the event last year, and with COVID and all the technical issues, we got some of the story out. So I'm really excited about the opportunity to share this story with you today. And so here's what I want to talk about. One is the origins of the Tupelo story. We'll not spend a lot of time on that, but it really is an inspiration, and it has an interesting symmetry with the Ord, Nebraska story that I am going to go into greater detail. I'm going to summarize some of the key learnings, some of the resources that are available, and have a few final thoughts. And as Juliana indicated, we'll have plenty of time for conversation and discussion at the end. Many of you may or may not be familiar with Tupelo, Mississippi, in northeastern part of the state. It's rural, probably best known for being home to Elvis. But in 1999, Vaughn Grisham, with support from the Kettering Foundation, published what I think is one of the most remarkable books, Tupelo, The Evolution of a Community. And Vaughn really captured this transformation of what was once one of the poorest, most distressed rural communities in the United States to one that was achieving much higher levels of success. And critical to that pivot was a community that was rooted in Jim Crow segregation, that began to embrace the idea that its African-American population was an asset. And if the community would support it, they could grow not only a stronger economy, but a more prosperous community. And for many of us, this was an inspirational book that said it's possible, even in the most difficult and challenging environments, it's possible to grow successful communities. And that really transitions then to Ord, Nebraska. And let me just kind of give you a quick MO. North Central Nebraska, I've got a map up next. It's rural by almost any standard, moderately isolated. It was founded in the 1880s, so settlement came to the western part of the United States after the Civil War in terms of European American settlement. And this is a community that peaked in the 1980s, like many in the Central Great Plains, with just 2,700 residents. Today, it has just over 2,000 residents, and that represents a pretty significant decline from the peak to today of nearly a quarter of its population. In the 1990s, this was a community that was anchored in two economic sectors, commodity agriculture, and it served as kind of an area hub city, providing healthcare and other services to residents in the region. This map gives you an idea. Ord's that gold star in the center, so kind of right in the center. This is a transition area from row cropping, the production of corn and soybeans into what we call the Sandhills, which is cow-calf cattle country. And so commodity agriculture is core to this region's economy. Just some pictures of the community, an aerial photograph. This could be a picture of any community in the Great Plains region of America. This is an area that has some remarkable natural resource amenities, which is one of the development strategies, canoeing, a reservoir, and a remarkable landscape. It's also a story about Gene and Bob Stoll. Bob is one of the ongoing leaders, and he and Gene were partners in this. And we've got a resource we're going to make available to you called The Long Drive Home by Matthew Hansen, a Nebraska journalist who has captured the Ord story through Bob's eyes. It is a powerful testament to what is possible for a community that in the 1980s was hopeless, was in decline, was divided and conflicted, and today is thriving. One of the commitments that this community has made to the idea of arts and humanities as a community building strategy. And this is a picture of the Husk. This is on the historic Courthouse Square, the old movie theater. And today it has been repurposed into a community center, a gathering place, but also the locus of a very robust arts and humanities environment. The Nebraska Community Foundation has done an assessment of all the arts and humanities resources in this region, and that has really stimulated. This is a way to bring people across political divides, religious divides, whether they go to public schools or home schools, to come together and to build community together. This is also a community that has had empowering leadership that's created something our colleague David Iaquinta calls agency, resident agency, the ability of citizens in a community to say, we need to do something. And there's no better example of this than the multi-million-dollar water park, where a group of parents came together and said, we need a better resource for our kids in our community. And by the time it was all done, over $3 million was raised to build this facility, which is a regional attraction in the community. Grassroots organizing at its very best. Now, a little bit about the development journey, and then I'll talk some about the community's performance. In the 1990s and 2000s, this community participated in something called Hometown Competitiveness. Some of you may be familiar with this. This was an initiative that was supported by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation as part of their 75th anniversary celebration. Nebraska Community Foundation, the Heartland Center for Leadership Development, our organization, and others were involved. And HTC was a foundational partner. And it's one of the lessons I'll talk about, but this is a community that has reached outside of its boundaries to learn, to get inspired, and to find solutions that has then been adapted into their own unique strategy. So let me just kind of talk about this transformation. We won't be able to go into it in great detail, but Matthew's story that we're going to share with you really does. And we also have a video that was produced recently by the Nebraska Community Foundation that tells this story. But in the 1970s, the best way to describe this region and this community was a place that was in slow decline. And in our part of rural America, decline is manifested in the outmigration of residents. People simply pick up and move someplace else where there's greater economic opportunity. And so there was this slow decline that was well rooted, going way back into really post World War II. And then in the 1980s, the agricultural crisis, some of you that are old enough remember the Russians invaded Afghanistan. We had a commodity embargo, and also it was a time of extremely high interest rates. And there were massive farm foreclosures and losses of businesses on Main Street. And Ord was really hit because it was so dependent upon commodity agriculture. And it was at this point that people like Bob Stoll and Gaylord Nelson and others said, if we don't do something different, this will not be a community, as Bob says, where I want my children and grandchildren to grow up in. And in the 1990s, we kind of call that decade their search for solutions. They reached out to utilities, they reached out to the university. That's when we became involved, and others, to say, how can we build a better community? And one of the hallmarks was the willingness of this community to talk to other communities in not only Nebraska, but outside of Nebraska that were doing remarkable work, figuring out how to build affordable housing, address childcare needs, to build a stronger economy. And in so many ways, 2000 was the pivot year. This was the year that this community not only began to coalesce around a strategy, but it also began to tax itself, mobilize resources and people to implement that strategy. And as we then go into the decade of the 2000s, this was a period of investment and progress, but it was still too soon to say, had this community transformed itself? But by the time we get into 2010, 2020 timeframe, at this point, this community and its region really began to differentiate itself from comparable communities in the Central Great Plains based on some analysis that our colleague Kathy Kotowitz has done using peer community comparisons. One of the central stories is Misco Sports. This is a picture of the downtown organized around the county courthouse. And Misco Sports started out in the 1880s as a saddle shop and tack stop. And over the years, it became a sporting goods store. And in a community of 2,000, supporting a brick and mortar sporting goods store is a really tough challenge. But Misco's managed to survive, but was kind of reaching the end of its ropes about 6 years ago. The last family owner wanted out. And there were two young workers who, a husband and wife, that said, we want to take over the store. They were in their 20s, did not have deep family financial backing. And the community says it's important for us to create pathways for young people who want to live in our community, want to come back to our community to buy and start businesses. And so the community worked with this young couple and helped them put together a financial package that included bank financing, family money, gap financing through the city's loan fund, as well as a group of investors who actually bought the building, the inventory, the fixtures, and then leased them back to Thomas and Megan to operate. Within about 4 years, this couple got on their feet and they were able to buy back those assets and then ultimately re-energized an e-commerce business that provides sporting goods in a multi-county region that extends up into South Dakota over into Iowa. This is an example of entrepreneur-based development at its very best, saying, we have people, how can we help this couple ensure that this business continues into the future? So just a little bit around some of the impacts. So this represents 30 years of sustained effort. And based on our work throughout North America, I think one of the biggest challenges, we'll see these sparks in communities where for 2-3 years, maybe a decade, the community really is committed. It's really working its strategy. It's willing to invest in its future. But then leadership changes or a degree of prosperity is achieved and the effort pulls back and it atrophies. And then the community falls back into the more historical patterns of decline. The fact that Ord has now sustained this for over 30 years really speaks to the fact that there is deep buy-in in this community, that waking up every day, fostering development by supporting people, makes a difference. Now, we by no means have documented all of the new investment, but we've documented at least $250 million of public and private investment that has been mobilized in this community. And again, this is a community of about 2,000 people in a region of about 10,000 people. And so this is a remarkable number, over $100 million invested in small, locally owned businesses. And about 80% of that portfolio represent what we would call individuals or entrepreneurs on the margins, people who 10 years ago would not have been able to get support from the community. Women, new residents, young people like Thomas and Misco's. The community was now figuring out how to support the full diversity of its residents in fostering a stronger economy. The other thing that happened is this community went from a 2-sector to an 8-sector economy. They built out their destination tourism sector. They almost in the 1980s lost their hospital. They're now one of the leading regional rural healthcare systems in the Great Plains. And they achieved significant job creation. And this is key to the fact that they've been able to stabilize their population, which I'll talk about. If we look at the period, the 30-year period from 1970 to 2000, there was a net decline of 18% in terms of overall jobs in the community. But between 2000 and 2018, and we've just looked at the more recent numbers that have come out from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, they saw nearly a 10% increase. Well, that may not seem dramatic, but that's nearly a 30% differential. And in a community like this, this means a huge difference. There are now opportunities for people who want to live in the community, people who want to come back to the community, new people who want to move into the community. The other thing that they did is it wasn't just Ord, this island in this rural region. They really committed to regional development. And the best example is when Ord built their pool, at the same time they lost their bowling alley. And up the road is Burwell, historically a strong community in terms of being competitive. And Burwell still had a great bowling alley. So Ord said, we're not going to rebuild our bowling alley. We're going to now work with Burwell to use theirs. And Burwell said, we're going to use your pool. And so there's this culture of collaboration that has strengthened the region. Probably the most important indicator for this community is what's happened to its population. Now, this community is not growing rapidly, and it really doesn't want to grow rapidly in terms of population, but it's stabilized its population, which is really pretty remarkable because in rural counties in Nebraska, over the last decade, we've seen nearly a 19% decline in population. So the fact that it's stable is significant. But what's really critical is look at this number on the right-hand side of this slide. They saw a net gain of 54% in their 30 to 30-year-old age cohort in the community. This means that young people are deciding to stay. Young people are deciding to move to the community or come back. And of course, in many cases, they're having families, which is contributing to the success of the school system. But this is also those early formative years of career and entrepreneurship that's really driven this. We've seen a net growth in ventures. They have a much stronger local tax base. And this is critical because they issued a local option sales tax to support this strategy. There was strong opposition, but they managed through a plebiscite to get it passed. And today they can document that the tax base is much larger, more broad, and consequently, the actual tax burden is less in this community. I think one of the more interesting indicators is this apex outcome of, are we creating household wealth? And are we creating that across the range of the people who live in our communities? And I think it's really telling that if we look at where the community started in 2000 compared to today, adjusting for inflation, average household net worth has increased from 305,000 to 437,000. Much harder to measure, but based on survey work, there has been a profound cultural change. One of the things that Rick Foster with the Kellogg Foundation was interested in was this thematic of hopelessness. And that's captured in the 2005 Kellogg video that was produced on Ord that we'll make available to you. And today, the glass is half full, not half empty. There is this culture that says we can solve problems, we can take advantage of opportunities, we can build a better life in this community. And David Iaquinta's recent work of interviewing people during the pandemic and how they've managed to work through a very challenging period of time, those interviews you might find interesting because they really speak to this cultural change. So let me talk about, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, Juliana, because I want to make sure that we wrap up here pretty soon so we can go to questions. But
You're doing great.
okay, all right, thank you. So here's the top 10. And if you listen to our podcast with Bob Stoll that we're going to drop next month with Pathways to Rural Prosperity, you'll get his list. If you read Matthew Hansen's story, you'll get his list. But these themes are all there. It really begins with commitment, the commitment on the part of a small group of citizens to say, we have to do something different, and then taking the time to engage others in the community in conversations and co-creating a game plan. The second, and this is something that Bob and others speak to, is community has to get real about investment, that you can't just bootstrap this, that you really have to understand that it takes millions of dollars invested in schools and healthcare and streets and housing and in businesses to really bring about this kind of transformative change. The third one is a smart strategy, and this really speaks to item number 6. This community not only engaging within itself in conversations about what it should do, but going down the road to talk to Cliff Messner in Central City, Nebraska, who had figured out how to build affordable housing, and say, how can we do that in Ord, that led to the development of subdivisions, infill, and rehab that has created a much more robust affordable housing piece. Perseverance, I already said, they've been at this for a long time and they're hung in there, and they're now thinking about, okay, we need to recommit to a next generation strategy that's going to continue to move us forward. I talked about external help. I talked about empowering leadership, but I think one of the other things is entrepreneurial. And that is this community in its formal leadership program fosters entrepreneurial behavior. That's a central thematic. They have a rural class community leadership program that's funded through their community foundation. And that really is the idea that how do we bring people together? How do we find creative solutions? And how do we make that happen? David's idea of community agency. This is so powerful that when leadership empowers the community to say, we need to do multiple things at the same time, and folks have the ability to find the resources, the support, the permission to move ahead. And then finally, and I think this is on the cusp, while Ord did a better job at creating equal opportunity for women, new residents, young people that might have been discriminated, well, not might have, were discriminated 10 years ago against, they're now on the threshold that because of their growth, how do they embrace greater diversity? And that's particularly going to be new residents moving in from Nebraska's growing Hispanic community that came to Nebraska to work in our meatpacking plants and are now putting down roots and moving to communities like Ord's, oftentimes owning and operating businesses. So I'm just going to go through these very quickly because we're going to break it about the half hour, right, Juliana, to go to discussion. Is that still good?
That's right. Yeah, half hour, a few minutes after is okay too.
Okay, so let me just lay out a few things. One is helping communities understand this reality, and let me cue this all up. For most communities in rural America, there was a natural resource industry. If you're in, Grants Pass, Oregon, it was timber. If you're in our part of the country, it was agriculture. And, if you go into northwestern Arizona, it's mining. And so most of our economies in rural America are underlined by agriculture. And as those industries developed, we created trade centers, places like Ord to serve them, to provide the churches and the post offices and all those things. And then for some rural communities that were larger, after World War II, they were able to attract manufacturing. Now, those industries may all still be there, but they're no longer sufficient to support the population base that we need to have great schools and healthcare and all the things we want. And that's where entrepreneurship comes in and is reflected by those dashed lines. Another thing that I think is important is to not see entrepreneurship as a a one-off, one additional strategy that a community can add. Our friend Brian Dabson, who I think is one of the country's best thought leaders on this, Brian says the first investment should be in people. And that's what Ord did. It invested in leaders, young people, entrepreneurs, others in the community. And when you do that, you have the ability to engage in effective community building and then to take on economic development. The other thing that Brian would talk about is the first investment is in entrepreneurship, that if you build an environment where local people can thrive and running a great nonprofit or a for-profit business, you create the environment where other kinds of economic development become much more feasible. And particularly with attraction today, it may not be attracting a branch manufacturing plant. It may be attracting a family and an entrepreneur that brings or starts a business in your community that makes a difference overall. I'm going to end with this and then we can go to discussion, but this is kind of the change model, and I'm an economist, so bear with me, but I think it's important. This reflects what we've learned over 40 years across North America, that if our goal is to increase the prosperity, and I mean that in a broad way, not just making a few people wealthy, but broadly shared prosperity, the investment is increasing entrepreneurial behavior, not just entrepreneurs who run businesses, but is your healthcare system, is your school system, is your local government, are your nonprofits behaving entrepreneurially, focusing on opportunities, learning how to organize, attract capital, all those kinds of things that strong entrepreneurial behavior does. When that happens, we begin to get a cascade of impacts. The first is your community becomes more competitive and attractive. The second is it inherently begins to diversify, not only economically, but because of growth, it's going to diversify socially and culturally. And when these things come together, you increase the overall value of the economy. And what that simply means is there's more money in the economy. There's a stronger tax base. There's more philanthropy, which allows this community to invest in itself. And when those are all brought together, folks, it increases the resiliency of the economy and the society, which is so important given the uncertainty of our times. Now, we believe that when you create wealth, you have the opportunity for greater community philanthropy. And when you have philanthropy, then you have your own discretionary capital to invest in things like leadership programs, youth entrepreneurship programs, and the like. So I'm going to actually stop here because I think we've gotten wonky enough, and I'm going to just take us to some discussion. I had a few more slides, but I think folks get the flavor, and I'd much rather have a bit of conversation that maybe would take us to some of these other points, if that seems appropriate.
Sure, absolutely. So I'll take us back to gallery view here so we can all be a part of the discussion, or whoever would like to be. I know I have some questions. Would anyone have questions off the bat they'd like to pitch to Dawn? Anything to add? If not, I can fill in. So one thing that comes to mind for me is when you're talking about, increased resiliency, sustainability, diversity, I think that accessibility, what Jules is going to be talking about next month, is really important. And I wonder if they would be willing to jump in now and give us a little bit of what that might look like next month. I know we're planning on doing it at the end, but I feel compelled that we should hear a little bit about that. And then I have some other questions for Dawn after that. Go ahead, Jules.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. My name is Jules Good. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the founder and consulting lead at Neighborhood Access, which is an accessibility consulting firm that works with organizations to help them make their presence and processes and practices more accessible to the disabled community. And I'm super excited to have been invited to give a roundtable discussion next month about building accessible entrepreneurial ecosystems. And so what I'm hoping to do with that time is kind of walk through the different parts of an entrepreneurial ecosystem, particularly for, those in rural areas with that focus, and talking through some resources and strategies that are available for making each part of that more accessible. I know we have folks who work in kind of a variety of different fields. Some of you may be business owners, some of you may work for community development efforts. Some of you are in academia. So I kind of want this to be applicable to a variety of different fields, and give you a lot of concrete resources to walk away with, so that you can make your entrepreneurial ecosystem wherever you are more accessible and more inclusive of folks with disabilities.
Thank you so much, Jules, for sharing. So appreciate that. Don, I was wondering, so that top 10 list for lessons learned, are those same values and areas of focus? Does that seem to translate widely throughout work that you've done with other groups as well?
Yeah, one of the things that we're involved with is we're part of a national consortium of story capture. And, if any of you listening today have stories that you think are powerful, I mean, this is how we got to know Hannah Grimes, was talking with Marianne about the Hannah Grimes story and providing a little bit of help in the capture of that remarkable story. And so I think that top 10 list is pretty universal. And I think it really begins to help explain why certain communities do better than others. Right now, I'm working on a chapter in a book that Norm Walzer is curating. And the title of the book is The Future of Rural. And I see that title with a question mark, because my answer is it all depends. If communities are willing to do these things, if they're willing to learn from each other, if they're willing to invest, if they're willing to find their optimal strategy, then I think most rural communities have a very bright future. But those that are struggling because being divided is, folks can't get along and refuse to find a way to get along, or they're not willing to invest, they're going to have a much harder growth. So I think these are universal attributes that when we look at our other case stories from across the country, Klamath Falls down in Oregon, you find the same things at play.
Wonderful, thank you. And for anyone else on the call, when you think about the features that contribute to vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystems, what are some things that you found in your work? What would you add to that list?
Somebody's got to break the ice.
I'm a patient person.
Yeah. I know these, just some of the names. These are folks that have insight.
And I believe the settings are that you can unmute yourself if you would like to talk, but if you're having trouble unmuting yourself, you can let me know and I'm happy to unmute you. Yes, and Jules says obvious answer, but accessibility, yes.
Could you repeat the question one more time? I got distracted and didn't catch it. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So the list that Dawn shared of kind of the top 10, was it lessons? Is that how you worded it? From the Ord Story and from Tupelo, such as commitment, investment, all those sorts of things that create vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystems. So for all of you, if you're doing similar work in the world, what words would you add to that? What have you found to be key features of vibrant rural communities?
Juliana, if I may.
Yes.
Don, I think that one of the things that, I'm just looking at the list, one of the things that comes to mind is the importance of defining vision and goals. That the community comes around a sort of specific target, a specific set of principles and goals that they're going to work towards. And the hard part, or the first part of that, is figuring all of that out based on everything that you've talked about. But then the second hard part is to articulate it in a form and in a way that it becomes the sort of guiding set of principles that the rest of the work can follow. Is there something along those lines that was that has been part of the Ord experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two things. One is in the 1970s and 1980s, Ord, like a lot of communities in the Great Plains that were going through the egg crisis, which was really wrenching if you look at the number of suicides that occurred during that period. I mean, people were devastated. I was the one that lost the farm or the family business. And communities like Ord, in Ord's case, had pretty much been taken over by the Posse Comitatus and the John Birch Society. And you had people driving around in pickup trucks with guns, and you had book burnings and very anti-change, very conflicted, very divisive. Might sound a little reminiscent to some of what we're going through today. And so the first thing Ord had to do was say, we are not going to be controlled by this minority group. We want to do change. We want to use our city for good. And they were able to overcome that challenge. And what's interesting now is many of the folks who were part of those movements are now part of the development effort. The community has healed itself. That was the first thing. The second is, to the point I made, is this is a community that reached outside of itself to look to other communities that were doing better. What were they doing? To get strategic planning help. That's what the utility, the public power utility did, is came in and they did strategic planning, and then the university helped them with strategic planning. And what I would say is during that 1990s period that we call the search for solution, they evolved a very smart strategic vision that was really catalyzed from an energy standpoint around, we want this to be a community that we can proudly tell our kids and grandkids, if you want to come home, this is a great place to create your future. That was kind of their rallying call. But yeah, through that decade of the 90s, by the time they got to 2000, they had a pretty sophisticated vision and game plan that was broadly shared sufficiently in the community to pass taxes and bond issues and get organized and do a whole bunch of stuff. Did that speak to your question?
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering, is there a published master plan or strategic plan as per what you've described that is available?
Yeah, we've got a whole collection of resources that we've curated. Of course, we had to go back and reconstruct history because nobody was chronicling this as we went, although some of us were there, but we weren't taking very good notes. And so before we're done today, I'm going to give you an outline of the resources we're going to share. And then it's a fairly large collection. This has been a major effort by both the community and by our team. But then if you're looking for something specific, and I can sure suggest where you want to look to get a sense of what their game plan was. But in Ord's case, it was organized around 5 things. Entrepreneurship is a way to grow a stronger economy, engaging youth, and making the proposition that this community is someplace you want to live. Their third pillar was a very deep commitment to leadership and organizational development using kind of entrepreneurial leadership. They made a very deep commitment to community philanthropy to create permanent resources to support a lot of this programming work so it wouldn't disappear after that grant period. And then the 5th thing that they really added was using the arts and humanities as a way to build relationships and community. And so when you distill it all down, their game plan is organized around those 5 buckets, but they weave together to create the high level of outcomes that we've documented.
Awesome. And Don, I did put a link in the chat. It should be the last comment. And is that the library that you're talking about with the resources?
Yeah, you got it. Anne's put
Okay.
together a topical page. If you go to that link, You can view the 2005 Kellogg video, the more recent one that was done last year. You can get Matthew Henson's story, and you can get, we've got a whole collection of entrepreneur stories. You can get access to all of the resources that are there. And there's a summary piece that kind of gives you an overview so you can navigate. Because again, this is 3 years of work in the making. And so it's a very comprehensive community case study. But I would start with the 2021 video and then read the Hanson story. That's where I would enter this. And then if you're interested, there's a lot more.
Okay, so you said the 2021 video and then the Hanson story is the best place to start?
Yep. The Long Drive Home by Matthew Hanson. Those two things. The video is very quick, but it'll give you a real feel. And then you read Matthew's story, you'll get a sense. But if you want to get into the more granular stuff, it's there. And if you've got questions, I'm looking for this. How did they do leadership development? Just drop me an email and I can help you navigate so you don't have to wander in the wilderness too long.
Awesome. And I love what you mentioned about looking to other communities doing better. That's one of like the cornerstone features of what Radically Rural does.
Right.
Yes, we're bringing new ideas to the forefront. We're on the cutting edge, that sort of thing. But also we're taking what we know is already working somewhere and we're elevating that as a model for others to use. So I love that. And I think that willingness to accept help and give help, that mutual relationship, whether it's on a personal, institutional, municipal level, I think is really beautiful to see. And I'm curious, so Dawn, I keep hearing about, like, literally this year, dozens of amazing stories about what's coming out in Kansas and Nebraska and other Great Plains. Like, what's happening in the Great Plains? Why is it what you've described already today that's just spreading like wildfire there? Like, what is happening in that area?
Yeah, well, and again, I have a bias because this is my home, but I think part of the progress, and let me illustrate it this way, is I really believe in what we call a top-down, bottom-up strategy. The community has to own this. The community has to figure it out. But if you have to do it on your own, it's like, okay, I need to get trained as a doctor, but nobody's going to help me. I just got to go figure this out on my own. I mean, using that as an analogy, that's really much tougher than if you go to a medical school and, you've got a system that trains and educates you on how to be a doctor. And we got a lot of that going on where people are just trying to figure this out on their own. They're good, but they know what they know and they don't know what they don't know. And so I think one of the differences is in Minnesota, for example, you have the McKnight Foundation created the Regional Initiative Foundations. These are regional. They partner with rural communities in Minnesota. They've been at this now for over a quarter century. And you see a material difference in those communities because they have a partner. So if they need to figure out how to do finance, if they need to network, how do you do childcare? There's infrastructure there that's robust in its scale. And so that's one model of this top-down, bottom-up partnership. In Nebraska, I think part of it is, for better or for worse, in the 1990s, we created the Nebraska Community Foundation, modeled after the South Dakota Community Foundation, and it now works with over 400 rural communities. Again, a tremendous learning network, so that if you're trying to figure out how to do infill housing, you can go into that network and find communities very quickly that know how to use Nebraska law and federal law to do infill housing. Well, that's an amazing asset. And so I think a lot of the good stuff in Nebraska is because of that network and the fact that you've got a statewide robust partner that really believes in co-creation, asset-based development, the right stuff. And in Kansas, it's Network Kansas. And it was serendipity. It was a law passed in 2004. The right people created it, the right people were hired to run it, and it has empowered this entrepreneurship juggernaut. In the last 5 years, $500 million of entrepreneurial financing has occurred in a very rural state. And that's pretty remarkable. And so when we look around the country, where you have regional or state organizations that are really robust partners, I think it accelerates the learning, but it also creates a culture that says, don't be embarrassed if you don't know how to do this. Just ask.
Exactly.
And that creates a much more constructive environment for change.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And thank you, Kyle, for filling in the blanks. So I want to make sure we have those resources you mentioned correctly. So one was says I can't minimize while I'm recording. One was the Minnesota Initiative Foundations.
Yep,
is that right?
That's the right link, Greater Minnesota, and that'll get you there. The other one was the Nebraska Community Foundation, and that's I can add that because it's got an odd address. And then Network Kansas, if you simply do a word search for that on your browser, it'll come up.
Yeah, and for those of you who aren't familiar with Network Kansas, I wasn't until this year, but it's mind-boggling. I've continually sent out this to folks as a model for funding. Do you want to give kind of an overview, Don, of what Network Kansas does? Because I think it's just such a good resource for anyone doing this kind of work.
Yeah, its mission that was articulated in state law, but it's now a quasi-public organization, which I think was a good design element. Its mission was to bring resources to underserved entrepreneurs throughout Kansas, but with a particular focus on distressed communities, both urban and rural. And it first started working in rural. And instinctively over time, what they did is they said, we need to partner with communities. And let me just illustrate that. So they were doing their annual assessment 2 years ago, and they, again, remarkable deal flow. I mean, they were moving a lot of capital to a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of communities, from very small communities to the African-American Chamber of Commerce community in Kansas City, Kansas. But they noticed that there were certain places where there should be lots of entrepreneurial juice. And I'll take you to a community like Garden Center in southwestern Kansas. It's a meat packing town, so there's a very large first and second generation population of Latinos from Mexico, Central America, South America. And it's extremely entrepreneurial. And Network Kansas looked and said, we're not financing any deals with this community. What's wrong? So they had the capacity to go to the community, begin to build a relationship with the leadership within that sub-community in that part of Kansas and say, why aren't we supporting your entrepreneurs? And they took the time to learn, and they crafted new technical assistance and loan programs that were geared to the realities of that community. And lo and behold, they are now doing a lot more deal flow, empowering that community, creating a level playing field for folks who have traditionally been marginalized from access to bank capital and traditional entrepreneurship lending and technical assistance, language barriers, cultural barriers, trust barriers. But it had to be done with the community. They couldn't just come in and do it. They had to take the time to build the relationship with the community. They did the same thing with a group in Wichita in the urban area with African-American female entrepreneurs. Again, lots of juice, a lot of activity, but these folks were struggling to find resources. Sat down with those communities and over 3 years developed a set of solutions. And now we're seeing much greater access. That's the power of Network Kansas, of saying, our goal is to serve people who aren't getting served, who aren't finding the bank loans. How do we make this happen? And doing that really one community at a time, figuring out what it takes with the knowledge of that community to build solutions.
Awesome.
That's why it's so successful, in my opinion.
Awesome. Amanda, you have a question?
Yes, I just wanted to ask Don about how rural communities can maintain healthy growth and tourism, maybe in particular, while maintaining community integrity and resources for residents. I come from the Driftless area of Wisconsin, the
Mhm.
Viroqua area in particular, which is in many ways doing very well right now. I would say in the last 10 to 20 years, we've been getting a lot of attention, especially from people retiring from bigger cities down south like Chicago. And while that is really revitalizing our small community, and it's a very vibrant community, one of the issues that we're seeing is that it's kind of gentrifying,
Mhm.
and therefore people who are actually from the area and maybe moved away and want to come back, or just want to buy a house in the town, it's getting to be unaffordable. So yeah, I was just wondering, like, how do we avoid gentrification and grow in healthy and sustainable ways?
Great question, because on the one hand, we think about communities that are struggling to find opportunities, and then we have other communities that are achieving success, but it's through gentrification. And I really do believe that that's a powerful trend. We've got a paper called Urban America is Filling Up that addresses this idea of the next best places, that this kind of urban to rural migration that's occurring, that's happening based on what you're saying in your area. So if we use Klamath Falls as an example, communities like Bend, Oregon, got discovered. Folks out of Northern California, Seattle, Portland began moving to Bend. There was affordable housing, great schools, not a lot of congestion. And now the cost of housing in Bend is comparable to Portland. And it's created gentrification. It's displacing local residents. Now, if you look at the GDP of that community, it's off the charts. But did it enhance the residents of that community? Not really. It displaces them. So this is a real dynamic. And in Klamath Falls' case, this is a community that has really struggled because of the collapse of the timber industry. Yet it's close to Crater Lake. It has amazing assets, and it's being discovered. People are saying, you know, that house that'll cost me $1 million in Bend, I can buy for $150,000 in Klamath. And so part of the conversation going on in Klamath right now is you can focus on the past where you had all this distress, but the fact is you're one of these next best places, and people are going to come, money's going to come. So you better start committing to smart growth. How do you do development in a way that it doesn't result in gentrification and displacement? I'm not saying it's easy, but the biggest challenge right now in Klamath Falls is getting the leadership to recognize the fact that in 10 years, it could look more like Bend than it does today, which means you're going to get gentrification and displacement of current residents. I don't think any rural community wants that kind of development. Now, it advantages some people. What we want to do is create an economy where all of our residents have an opportunity to have housing, to have good childcare, to have good schools, to have a career. And, in cases like yours, really committing to aggressive, smart growth strategies, I think is important, because once you get discovered, people and capital will come, and boy, it's a powerful force that once it gets going, it's very difficult to guide. I wish I had better answers, but a big chunk of rural America is facing exactly what you're talking about. So it's a real opportunity, but it's also a real issue where we could win the gross domestic product battle, but lose the quality of life community battle.
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
Thank you so much.
I've been known to say many times GDP is not an indicator of quality of life by any means, and especially getting down to rural communities as well. So we have 2 more questions in the chat. We only have a couple more minutes, so we'll see how far we can get. Louisa says, can you speak to the time it takes for these communities to make changes? You mentioned 30 years for Ord. Do rural communities have that time? What are your thoughts on communities wanting to make these changes today using all that you've learned from Ord?
So I'm going to use my title that I'm using with Norm's book, It All Depends. I think if communities are willing to take the time, and I mean actually jump in the car or get on a plane when it's safe to do that again,
Yeah.
to go visit, begin to identify communities that are solving critical issues that are important to your community, whether it's housing or childcare or education or economic development. And I'm absolutely convinced that if you'll look at stories like Ord and look at their lessons, I mean, really take time to spend with it. And that's just one example. What we feel is communities today, if they'll adopt those top 10 things and really commit to them, that you can go from decline to transformative change in a decade. It doesn't need to take 30 years. Because a lot of what Ord had to do was figure this all out for the first time. They didn't have a story like Ord. They weren't even aware of the Tupelo story. I mean, that was not available, maybe not relevant. So I think that's the important thing, is if communities will take the time to vision, to do their homework, build a smart plan, they can achieve significant progress that's demonstrated in 3 years and transformative change in a decade, which for me, that's a pretty remarkable time frame. If it takes longer than that, you're right. A lot of these communities are declining to the point that they may not have the wherewithal to turn that curve around.
Thank you so much. And thanks, Louisa. Since we're at the hour now, Don, would you be willing to drop your email in the chat so that for Beth and for any others who may have questions, and if they'd like certain aspects of it clarified, they could get in touch with you?
You bet. Well, Beth knows how to find me. We do some work together.
Oh, good.
But for everybody else, it's in the chat. It's real simple, don@e2mail.org, and don't hesitate to reach out to me.
Wonderful. Well, we so appreciate your time. And for everyone who's on the call, we'll be having these every second Wednesday of the month from 2 to 3 p.m., at least through July. And we have a lot of really cool upcoming sessions. So we'd love to have you join us. You can visit our website. I'll put that in the chat as well. If you'd like to see what's coming up and register for any of the others, we'd love to have you. So I'm going to put that in the chat right now.
Well, while you're doing that, thank you, folks. I appreciate the chance to share this story. It's not my story. It's the story of this remarkable community. I hope you found it inspiring and helpful.
At least I did. Thank you so much, Don. We've really, really enjoyed working with you so much this year, and wish you all a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll talk again soon. All right.
Okay.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.